Okay, class, so let us begin with the second aspect of what we started discussing in the previous lecture. That in our body, we have got this situation of the nervous coordination and the response, and our nervous system was made up of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and this system has got some functional cells in them, and these functional cells, we were referring to them as the neurons, we say. So for today's class, we would literally see that how what these neurons are, how they are designed, what are their types, and how they are rendering the different roles of getting the communication done between the receptors to the effectors of my body. So if I were to simply read this for you, so our nervous system that we have in the body, so this has a specialized cells in it, and these specialized cells they are referred to as the neuron, we say. And our nervous system fundamentally has got total of three types of the neurons in it. The first neuron that we have with us, so this is the sensory neuron. The second neuron that we have got with us, so this is the relay or the intermediate neuron. And the third type of the neuron that we have with us, so this is entitled as the motor neuron, we say. Now, if I were to recall some of the scenario from the previous class, so you see that in terms of the communication scenario, so there used to be the stimulus with us, which was a change in the environment, and from here, this would be detected by the receptors, we say. And from the receptors, information was going toward the central nervous system, having the brain and the spinal cord in it, that would act as a coordinator. And from there, we would be conveying the information to the effectors. We say that would include the muscles and the glands. So if I were to take the information from the receptors to the coordinators or to the central nervous system, so the neuron involved would be the sensory neuron. When I would take the information from the brain and the spinal cord to the effectors of my body, so the neuron involved would be the motor neuron, we say. And in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, if the information has to be conveyed, so the neuron involved would be the relay neuron, we say. So for the sensory neuron, what we say is that they transmit the electrical impulses or the communication from the receptors to the CNS. The relay or the intermediate neuron, they would convey the information between the sensory and the motor neuron, and the motor neuron would convey the information from the brain and the spinal cord to the muscles, we say. So if I were to tell you in case of this example, so you see this is a hot pan with me, and this hot pan is the stimulus. In the hands, we have got the receptors, and from the receptors, you see the information is being conveyed to this first neuron that we have with us, and this looks like this. So this is a sensory neuron. From the sensory neuron, the information would go to these neurons that we have within the brain and the spinal cord, and they are the relay or the intermediate neuron. The word intermediate itself indicates that this is coming some way in between the sensory and the motor neuron. And from the relay neuron, the information would be conveyed to this motor neuron, and this motor neuron would bring the electrical impulse to the effectors. Either it could be the muscle and it could be the gland, and they would respond according to what was decided by the brain and the spinal cord, and by that we would respond to a stimulus that we were exposed to in the external environment. And this is how an entire situation is brought about by, or the entire communication is brought about by these neurons that we have with us. Now, our idea would be that how come these different type of the neurons they look like. Now, if you were to see this first neuron coming up with you, which is a sensory neuron, so this sensory neuron would be lying in close association with the receptor cells. And these cells, if you remember, they were lying within the sense organs like the eye and the nose and the ears and the skin that we have. Now, here you see that these small projections that I'm showing you at the moment, if I simply zoom more, so here you see these are the dendrites. And from the dendrites, information is conveyed to this part, and this is a long extension. And this is what we refer to this as a dendron, we say. And from here, the information is coming here toward the cell body that we have got for the sensory neuron, and the cell body would have the nucleus, it would have the mitochondria, it would also have the ribosomes on them. Then out of the sensory neuron, you see the information would be carried to this short cytoplasmic extension that we have with us, and this is what we refer to this as an axon, we say. And then the axon then has got again these dendrites with us, and they would be making the communication with the relay or the intermediate neuron. So for the sensory neuron, what you have to keep it in your mind is that their cell body, it protrudes out. Their dendron is long, their axon is short. At the start of the dendron, we have these dendrites coming with us, and at the end of the axon, again, we have got these dendrites with us. Now, if I were to teach you to the intermediate neuron that we have, so again, these are the dendrites that we have for the relay neuron. At the center, we have the cell body. If we were to contrast between the cell body of the sensory neuron and the intermediate neuron, you see that for the sensory neuron, the cell body is entirely getting out of the main structure. But here we have got clustered here. So when the information would come from the axon of the sensory neuron, so it would be conveyed to the dendrites of the relay neuron. And from here, the information would go to the cell body, and out of the cell body of the intermediate neuron, there is this axon coming again. And these axons, again, at then they have got these short branches, and they would again be referred to as the dendrites, we say. Now, if I were to tell you about the motor neuron, so again in the motor neuron, we have got these short cytoplasmic extensions. These are the dendrites with us, and here we have got the cell body. So this part of the intermediate neuron and this part of the motor neuron, they resemble somehow or the other. But the difference is among the sensory neuron that we have here, and its axon if I talk about, and for the intermediate neuron, if you just look onto it, the axon that we have, the axon of the motor neuron in comparison is comparatively long. Okay, so out of the cell body again, this motor neuron has this axon getting out, and this axon at the end, this would make these extensions, and these they would make a contact with the effectors of your body. And in some of the cases, in some of the neurons, these dendrons that we have got in the sensory neuron and the axons that we have in the sensory neuron, so they are surrounded by this insulating material, and this insulating material is the myelin sheath that would prevent the loss of information when this is being conveyed by the sensory neuron. Likewise, for the motor neuron that I have, so not its dendrites, but rather than the axon that we have for the motor neuron. So this again has got these, you could say, myelin sheath around it, and that would again would be preventing the loss of information. And I would take you into the detail of this motor neuron, that how come the motor neuron that we have with us, so how this is adapted to be performing its function. So I would be taking this motor neuron from here, and then we would be seeing that how come the motor neuron structure is actually related to its function, where this has to convey the information from the central nervous system to the effectors of your body. So, since this neuron, motor neuron, is a cell, so what we expect is that it would have the cytoplasm, this would have the nucleus, this would have the cell membrane, and collectively these structure for any neuron, they would make its cell body. Then in the motor neuron, we have seen there are the dendrites and there are these axons with us, and there is this protective sheet that we are referring to this as the myelin sheath, and there is a major feature of these motor neurons specifically, and they are referred to as the nodes of the Renvir, we say. Now, if I were to take you here, so for this motor neuron, you see that I have got their nucleus, then they have their abundant mitochondria, and then here we have got their cytoplasm. And this cell membrane, nucleus, and the cytoplasm, this is making the cell body of the motor neuron. Now, out of the cell body, here you see that we have got these short cytoplasmic extensions of this, and they are the dendrites. Okay, so here we have these dendrites coming, and these dendrites at one part they are connected to the cell body of the motor neuron. Now, if we just try to be getting out of the cell body of the motor neuron, now here you see that I have got this long cytoplasmic extension getting out of it. So this is axon. And axon, and then you see that this would be making the contact with the effectors, not only the muscles but also the gland. So the appropriate point is that most of the part of this axon of the motor neuron, so it is basically covered by this sheath, and this sheath is the myelin sheath with me. And for the myelin sheath, what you need to know is that this would not allow the electrical impulses to be lost. But not all the part of the axon of the motor neuron is protected by the myelin sheath. But here you see at these points, we do not have any of the myelin sheath, so they would be referred to as the nodes of the Renmere, we say. Now the examiner is very much interested to know that how come the student, whether they are able to tell them any of the structure of the motor neuron, whether this is related to their function or no. So for the dendrites, you must know that they have the short cytoplasmic extension, and the function which they are rendering is that they would be carrying the information to this cell body that we have with us. The other point is that in these motor neuron, we have got abundant mitochondria, and these abundant mitochondria, they would release energy, and that energy is important for the transmission of the information that is being carried in these motor neuron or any of the other neuron in the form of an electrical impulse. Now, if you were to be relating the function of this long axon that we have, so you would say that this is a long cytoplasmic extension, and the role of this axon is that it would carry the information to the effectors of your body, inclusive of the muscles and the glands. And if I were to tell you that what this myelin sheath is actually doing, so we know that this is a protective layer and this would prevent the loss of information, because if the information would get lost on the way, then owing to that, my effectors of the body would not respond as they were supposed to. And in that way, our body would suffer a lot, or more of the damage would be incurred to it. Now, you see that a while ago I have mentioned the word, and that word was the nodes of Renmere. So we would see at this point that what actually the situation is. So you see that this part of the axon is protected by the myelin sheath. This part of the axon again is protected by the myelin sheath. But in between them, we have got some part where no myelin sheath is available. So this unmyelinated part of the axon that we have for this motor neuron. So they are referred to as the nodes of the Renvier. And the role of the nodes of the Renvier is that they would allow the electrical impulses to jump from one node to another node. And when the electrical impulse would jump like this from one node to another node, so this would try to be increasing the speed of the electrical impulse, or the transmission speed of the electrical impulse, and by that our response to the external environment would be very much fast. So if I were to simply bring about an interconnection in between the neurons, so you see here we have the dendrites of the sensory neuron, they are making a contact with the receptor cells, and then here comes a long dendron of the sensory neuron. It is coming till here, and the cell body protrudes out of the main structure. These sensory neuron, they have the short axon. Then here we have got this relay neuron. This part of the relay neuron that is making the contact with the axon of the sensory neuron, so this would be the dendrite. And likewise, if I were to talk about this motor neuron, so its dendrite would be making the contact with the dendrites of the relay or the intermediate neuron. And this axon of the motor neuron being long would go further on to be making the connection with the effectors of your body. So I hope you would be very much clear about the structures of the neuron, how they look like under the microscope, and how their structure is related to the function.